phone. I'm really sorry about that. So Paul, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
No, of course. And hi, Sandra, and hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. So in a very quick nutshell, I'm Paul Maskall. I'm the Fraud and Cybercrime Prevention Manager for the dedicated Card and Payment Crime Unit. Law enforcement in the UK, and as is most other countries, we do love the acronyms. It doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue all that well. But I essentially it is a national police unit. So we work around, again, aspects around fraud, scams, cybercrime, all these sorts of things. And again, my little corner of that unit is very much around education for fraud, scams, cyber, and anything that's online enabled crime in this respect as well. So my little baby of this subject is very much this topic that we're going to talk with Sandra today, is very much this idea around the psychology behind a lot of scams and fraud as well. So that's the plan. That's the plan.
Right. Let's kick off with your first question. Why do you think people don't see the risk and end up falling for scams? So
this is the interesting thing, is that most people talk about fraud and scams in a very specific way. So first of all, one thing that I remember, especially how got me into this sort of world, is that a good probably 8 or 9 years ago, I started working in cyber and fraud. Now, before that, I'd worked in traditional crime, if you will. So burglary, assaults, intelligence, again, the traditional crimes that you would normally associate with anything else. I worked in that for about 2 or 3 years, and then I worked in counterterrorism for about a year or two as well. Now, interestingly enough, is that when I left that world and went into cyber and fraud, and my job back then was very much the case of doing exactly what I'm doing now, is very much this kind of education piece, educating the public, educating businesses. But it was fascinating to me because most of the time, I didn't have to tell people that crime was bad. I didn't have to tell people that terrorism or burglary or all these sort of other things were bad. Now, what I mean by that is that from a cyber and fraud point of view, whether you're educating the public or educating the businesses, what I found very, very quickly was that actually most people didn't see the risk until it was actually a problem. People weren't necessarily motivated to go about educating themselves in advance of any situation, because especially like your webinar list today around burglary, it's a real difficult challenge when it's talking about, so actually it's something really tangible. It's your house, it's your belongings, it's your money, all these sorts of things that you're trying to protect. The issue here is that when it came to things like cyber and fraud, is that people didn't really associate it with any sort of emotional hook or issue. So on top of that, is that it got me down this very, very long rabbit hole of seeing how people assess risk. And the more and more I got down this long rabbit hole, is the more I understood that human beings, we are generally terrible at assessing any sort of risk. So for instance, let me give you an example. Air travel. Now, air travel, again, a good proportion of you on this call will be slightly concerned about air travel, for instance. Again, some of you will have an absolute pathological fear of getting on a plane, but even those amongst you that don't really have a problem with that, again, you might actually be motivated to know what to do in the event of. So if I say oxygen masks, life jackets, laminate cards, whatever it is that generally speaking, people are motivated to know what to do in the event of. The problem is people have a fear of this. People are scared of getting on a plane and all these sorts of things. And a number of factors that contribute to that. The problem is that if I said to you, well, statistically, and the probability of which is much more likely something happens to you, unfortunately, on the way to the airport than ever up in the air, would that make that person less scared of flying? No. Would that make that person more scared of cars? No, because that's not how we work. We essentially assess the risk or probability of something based on the emotional weight and the hook that it has with us in any given situation. So again, a pile up on the M25 does not make a good news story. No, does it make a particularly interesting movie, but an air crash and all these sorts of things do. So very often what we're exposed to is the issue. So what the problem is if I say terrorism, everybody on this call has an idea of what that crime is. or what that problem is. It's emotional, it's visceral. You've got an image in your head that represents the problem almost immediately. The problem is with fraud is that you don't. Is that fraud is a very intangible thing. We don't see the criminal. We don't see, again, this kind of aspect to us. We don't see the threat. Majority of all fraud and scams come through our technology. For instance, our phones, our text messages, again, emails, or it's on a website or social media or in our content. Is that because we're often detached from that, we don't necessarily have any sort of emotional hook as to understand the problem in the first place. Again, if you've ever seen anything to do with scams, it's normally blues, blacks, binary code, guys in hoodies, laptops, and that's the image that you kind of get with it. The problem is that because of this, people don't necessarily see the risk before it's unfortunately actually happened to you. The same with a car crash, is that you only associate the risk of getting in the car once you've actually been involved in a car crash, or you know a loved one that's been associated with one or being victimized, etc. in one. And that's the same with fraud and cyber, is that people don't necessarily see the risk in advance, but also we don't always have the intuition when it comes to these. But it's also in the question that we asked, is that why do people fall for it? Now, really dig down into that again, is that in education, in everything we do, we talk about people falling for it. The issue with this is that actually it puts both the blame and the control with you, the public, with the victim, with the situation. Because if I say don't fall for something, then again, I'm inherently saying that there's something wrong with you for you to fall for this given scam or fraud. The thing is that actually the way in which I manipulate a human being has been the same for thousands of years, and it just means you're a human being. And the problem is with this is that if I say to you, if I give you an example of Mrs. Miggins or Mr. Smith or etc. like that, who fell for this scam, very often we lack the empathy for those that have fallen for it. Because very often it's not like they've been burgled or they've been directly or indirectly targeted by a criminal who again took their data or stole their money. We don't always see that in fraud and scams. That's why we have so much stigma, so much understanding that people don't see the risk. And also we lack the empathy for those that have been victimized by it. And we don't always motivate ourselves in the first place as well. But yeah, it's a really difficult and very complicated world, is that actually for the majority of you on this call, you are the ones that are motivated. You are on this call in the first place to actually understand that actually this is a problem that I need to address and educate myself about. But the majority of the public, that's not the truth, unfortunately. So,
Paul, can I ask you, why do you think people are feeling so comfortable in sharing their data?
Well, it's interesting because we have a very, well, how can I, almost intangible relationship with our data and information. So especially as even over the last couple of years, if you think about it, we've only had what, 16, 17 years of iPhones, for instance. So again, actual smartphones, our relationship with technology has changed completely unrecognizably over the course of a decade and a half and a bit, basically. In the grand scheme of things, that's an incredibly short period of time when it comes to understanding how we have this relationship with technology, what we do online, how do we give information away as well. Now, interestingly enough, it's this kind of idea around, well, data, no matter what fraud or scam, no matter what sort of manipulation I want to do, it is as fundamentally about your personal information. It's fundamentally about who you are, your date of birth, what's your email address, what's all these different personal information that contributes to who you are as a person. But the thing is, when we go online, is that how do you prove who you are to anyone? And actually nowadays, that's actually quite thin, because if you think about it, every account that you log into is essentially your email, which is, again, the most publishable known thing about you, because who do you give, what piece of information do you give to everyone and everything you sign up to? Your email, but also your password. That's really all I do in order to authenticate who I am and what my account and my ownership over the account, whether it's Asda, whether it's Tesco's, whether it's Amazon, whatever platform it is that it's actually a very small amount of window of information. Now, if I say to you, for most of you, if you see somebody with armed with a clipboard in your local high street, what do you do? Now, majority of you will most likely take this massive semicircle around them, or try to avoid them, or try to avoid all eye contact and all these sorts of things. And Andrea said, yeah, I avoid. Absolutely. I do the same. Or I do the real British thing and just go, oh, no, I'm fine. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. But the fact is actually, if I asked you why, Amanda, depends if they're nice looking. I'm liking that, Amanda, very good. But this is it, is that actually the data in which we give away is that if I said to you why, and obviously Amanda's reservations aside, is that actually I don't trust them with giving my information away. I don't want to get spammed. I want to give to charity in my own time. You'll come up with a myriad of different excuses as to why you won't stop to talk to that person who is trying to make a living or to sell a ostensibly good cause in those sorts of respects. But very often it comes to, I don't trust them with my data, or I'm busy doing something else. The problem is that we don't always have that feeling, or that, oh, I'm busy, I'm doing something else, or something like that, when it comes to online. So that data is that actually the data in which you fill in on every single account that you find, every single discounted offer it may be, every person that's asking you, oh, could you please create an account so you can buy this product, or everybody asks for account and data, which is right. But also that also means that basically about 20 years, we've ended up being conditioned to give our data away, so we don't always see the value behind it. Again, I saw it in the chat beforehand, and this is a really good example, is that one person said, I won't touch online banking due to the security risks. I use telephone banking or real bank. Well, actually, the problem is, I hate to break it to you, and this is again part to how we see our data and how we do it. Online banking is actually the safest way you can do banking because again, there's so many different ways. Is actually you're physically exposed when you go to a real bank, or all these sorts of things. Telephone banking is easy to spoof and all these sorts of things. So actually online banking is one of the safest ways you can do banking. But that's the thing, is it comes down to this relationship we have with technology and how we perceive our information and data. Very often the only security risks that come with online banking is very much if I convince you to do something that you wouldn't want to do as well.
That's brilliant. Why do you think that cybercrime is so prevalent in today's society?
Well, you have this, like we were saying, the lot has changed in a comparatively very short period of time. Now, if you think about the impacts of, again, from a cybercrime, fraud, scams, actually the way, there's very little difference from my point of view. There's very little difference between pretty much all three. Because is that if it's cybercrime, essentially I want to break into a computer system. That's simplistic as cybercrime can be, really. I want to either steal data, I want to steal information, but that's through technical means. A fraud is essentially the idea around, I want to take your information and I want to open an account. I want to take money out of your account without your knowledge, all these sorts of things. But then on the other side, you have scams, which is very much, I directly influence you in some way, whether it's on the phone, whether it's in the email, whether it's a text message, and I get you to then transfer the funds in those given situations or give away your data or something along those lines. So that's the three key differences between all three. But if you go up a bit, is that every single person on this call has been told something that they wanted to hear at probably the wrong time they wanted to hear it. And the issue with this is that from a cybercrime, it all comes down to social engineering. And all social engineering is me trying to convince you that I am somebody that I'm not. So whether that be the police, whether that be NHS. We saw a lot of smishing or text message scams across COVID, across the pandemic in relation to NHS. We've seen them all the time. Luckily, the telecoms companies have done a great deal in order to try and combat a lot of those text messages, but we're still seeing them in our inbox. We're still seeing them on social media and online, and that's the difficulty. The reason why I think fraud and cybercrime is so much more prevalent nowadays is for a very, very different reason. Is that when was the last time you changed your personal mobile, Sandra? Exactly. But nobody does really. And if I probably asked most of the people on this call, you've probably only had a couple of changes since you bought a mobile phone, really, in reality. But that also goes for your personal email address. When was the last time you changed your personal email address? Well, again, most publishable thing about you. It's also the thing that you use for all of your accounts. And there's nothing necessarily saying that you should change it regularly at all. No, absolutely not. But what it does mean is that every single fraud and scam, or the majority of all fraud and scams, come through those methods. So whether it's a text message scam, an email scam, or phishing, whatever it is, it's going to come through those methods at some point. So if you think about it, how long you've had that data, and if I can then access your data or through a data breach, or you filled out a form that you shouldn't have, or all these sorts of things, or clicked on a link, or in these given situations, is it mean that criminals have a very sustainable resource in which to try and get hold of you? Because scammers, fraudsters, criminals, they are essentially very good at marketing. Unfortunately, that's what marketing is essentially, I want you to buy a product. I want you to do something that benefits me in this respect. And the problem is they're using it for a very, very different, more nefarious purpose. So data and information and personal information about you is out there. It's very often out there. It's about how we manage our personal information, how we give it away, what we do with our social media accounts, whether they're personal or private, or again, people are able to see it. And because data is so accessible, it also comes down to the fact that we have this very interesting relationship with technology. So for the majority of people, is that there is a flavor of fraud or a flavor of manipulation for everyone and anyone, no matter how old you are, no matter who you are, no matter what given situation you're in. The problem is if I say to you, have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner? Or if you've taken a, yeah, exactly. So have I, absolutely, on many occasions. Same with emails from colleagues or all these sorts of things, is that very often you read things in the way you want to read it. So because of these situations, because it comes through technology, is that what I tend to do is, no matter how much emotional situation I'm in, so all of us, like I said, has been told something they wanted to hear at the wrong time, you should have heard it, is that, for instance, in these sorts of situations, the reason why you took that text message the wrong way from a partner is because of your emotions, because of how you're getting on with your partner right at that moment, whether you had an argument that morning or whether you had a really nice breakfast or whatever it is. It can be a multitude of different reasons as to why you interpreted that communication in a different way. The problem is with this is that this goes for the same for pretty much all fraud and scams. Because, for instance, HMRC tax rebate scam, like one of the most common types of phishing email or scam that we've seen across the last 15, 20 years, across the board. Now, most of us know that that's going to be a scam, or we can feel relatively confident that you'd be in a situation like that, or you'd be able to flag it. The problem is, what happens if you've got financial anxiety? What happens if you've got a bit too much month at the end of your paycheck, or when the pension comes in, or something along those lines? What happens if it's a cost of living crisis? All these sorts of things and mounting pressures, again, give us this sort of situation where actually I'm not going to see the red flags around that email. What I am going to do is actually use my emotion and fixate on how much money can I get and when am I going to get it. Just like relationships, just like any given situations, we look back and we think, God, why did I not see the red flags or the situation in any given situation like that? is that it's so difficult to be able to understand our emotional sense in that respect as well. So from a cybercrime point of view, from a fraud point of view, it's the fact that our data is so prevalent and it's out there and it's easily accessible by most people, but also this fact that actually the methods in which I'm using, the technology, communication, phone calls, we're all more connected in a lot of ways, is that it's just given me this massive vehicle to be able to do that as well.
One of the questions that popped up in the chat was from Emmanuel, and he says, what should I do if I've accidentally given my details to a fraudster?
So in these given situations is that depending on how much information you're giving away. So again, if you know that it's definitely potentially a scam or a fraud, if it's, for instance, if you've given away bank information or bank data in that sort of aspect, is if you've just given personal information, is that, again, sometimes it's exposed in some way, is that it's probably good to maybe change your password depending on if it's associated with an account or something along those lines. But if you've given account data and information away, for instance, payment details or something, it's about notifying your bank absolutely immediately. Because it means that your card details are now potentially compromised in that respect. So if it's just your personal information, then unfortunately, very often there's not much we can do about that sort of situation when it's kind of been given to somebody, and we don't know who that somebody is. And very often we do that without really thinking about it online anyway. So, but if you've actually realized, you think, oh, hold on a second, was that a real website or a real form, or was that somebody that in order to take a payment? It's about notifying your bank immediately in that respect to make sure that your account is safe at that point of view. So does that make sense?
There's some fantastic stuff going on in the chat at the moment. Natalie,
yeah, the chat's massive. I was really chuffed with the engagement. This is brilliant.
Giving some great advice there on how to check whether your data has been compromised or in a subject to leaking, and how often that you should change your passwords rather.
So, Sandra, I'll add on to that is that, yes, have I been pwned is a really good resource to be able to see if you have been subject to a data breach. Now, again, from a data breach point of view, yes, is that sometimes you will do business or buy a product or make a payment, etc., on a completely legitimate organization or account. And without your input or without your fault or etc., is that it's this situation where they have been compromised or hacked or data has been gone out. So that's a really good resource to be able to check that you have been kind of exposed to it. However, what I also would say is that it's about understanding that we treat our data like the valuable thing it is that actually having kind of an intentional thought where, okay, this person's asking me for my data. Well, okay, well, if I said to you, I want to take all your money out of your bank and put it in your spare room and put it under the mattress, and I come to your front door and ask for your money, you'd probably have a little bit more to say about it. And I almost treat it like that. It's like, well, I'm not saying about being paranoid, because you also have to live. Unfortunately, again, you have to live the life, etc. And being paranoid about it also does get in the way in this very connected society. But what I am asking is very much that kind of conscious thought or conscious decision about, okay, well, they won't give away my data. I understand that. Unfortunately, it's one of the facts of living in very much cases nowadays. But who am I giving it to? How do I check who this person or this organization is in order before I give it away on that respect as well?
We've had a question from one of our participants about whether there are more online scammers now than when there were thieves and burglars in the pre-internet era, or are they just more visible? But there is an idea that a lot of this is organized crime and there are huge numbers of people doing it.
Fraud and scams makes up 42% of all major crime types in the UK. You are more likely to be impacted by a fraud and scam than, well, any other crime, by quite a considerable margin, unfortunately, because it essentially last year, and I think the year before, it was the fact that everybody every single person in the UK had been exposed to some level of fraud or scams or attempt on their data and information. Everyone. So you think that actually, in comparison to things like burglary and all these sorts of things, it's a massive issue. So from a scam artist point of view, there are a lot more scammers, etc., in that respect, because, as I said before, the data is accessible. Your data and information is accessible. If I can't get yours to work, I'll move on to the next person. It's just like marketing. It's very easy to do. It's also incredibly accessible on the basis that, for instance, our unit, I'll give you this example, is that our unit during COVID, because of all the restrictions, etc., we ended up becoming essentially the text message scam police. So we were tracking down a lot of serious and organized criminals and criminal gangs, etc., and linkages to this in relation to people sending out NHS track and trace, vaccine scams. Hello, this is a message from your GP. Click on this link, give away your information. We saw a lot of those. The problem is, out of the 45 people I think we arrested during that period, or that brief and just under a year, I think one was over 18. Fraud is accessible. Scams are accessible. The youngest we arrested was 12. So the fact is that fraud is so accessible and so easy to do, and because of the way in which we've just talked about, that people don't see the risk, we don't necessarily educate ourselves in the right way, but also the fact that we give away our data information, and unfortunately that is also both a positive and a negative in that respect. Why it's so prevalent, because somebody else said, oh, we don't change our postal address either. Well, no, absolutely. You don't change your postal address that much often, and the same with your emails and your numbers. So this has resulted in the fact that actually, because it's so accessible, and like my previous point where, well, we don't necessarily, how do I prove who I am online? Well, I can go on Facebook or a platform, and I can just create a fake profile within about the next 3 or 4 minutes, if that. There's nothing really to validate who I am in that sort of situation. So that's why it's so accessible. And to answer the question, a much more brief idea is absolutely there are so many, but also they don't care about borders. In the UK, for instance, we have 42 different forces, all on county lines and all these sorts of things. We also have national law enforcement that is down to our borders from the UK point of view. But also think about this fraudster or scam artist or individual can be, well, anywhere. So yes, in short, loads.
What would you say are your, I don't know, top 3, top 5, top 10 tips for keeping yourself safe? Or is there a way of looking at the world that's just going to help?
I think that you're absolutely spot on, Sandra, because the thing is that we don't always, because so when we get a scam or a fraud message, for instance, is that very often it's the case where we don't see the face. We don't have the face, we don't have a body language, we don't have a physical presence of the person that's trying to manipulate us. We don't have a situation where, and we're also very often in a comfortable environment. So, or a familiar environment. So I'm sat there with my phone or a computer in my dining room or in my office or at home or at work. I'm in a familiar place when I'm getting it. So it's not like I'm walking down a dark alley and then exposed to a danger. It's very much I'm always exposed, even when I'm in a safe place in that sort of environment. So it's very difficult for me to give you an education, because even if I say to you, these are the top 10 tips to protect yourself, most of the time in education, we ask you to trust your gut. And the more and more I do around behavioral science, and I hate to say this, is that our gut's not that good in these situations. Is that if you're like, for instance, again, why does a car salesman not want you to leave the showroom before you've signed on the dotted line? Well, it's because I know that you're emotional, you're excited. This goes for any sort of projects or whichever. And it's very much the case is I want to make you do something while you're emotional, because none of us are particularly good at thinking overly objectively when we are emotional. So as a criminal, I want you to essentially feel one or two sides of the spectrum. I want you to feel hope, excitement, passion. I want you to believe in me in relation to whether it's an investment fraud or some type of scam. Or I want you to be panicked, fearful, paranoid, anxious, something along those lines on either end of the spectrum. Because no matter what other end of the spectrum you're on, is that's very much the case where I can get you to do something that you'd objectively the next day realize that you probably shouldn't have done. So it's this kind of aspect. And again, I'm seeing in the chat around that social engineering. That is the basis of all social engineering, is that I'm going to use context. So hello, I'm from, again, there's a problem with your account, there's a problem with your router in computer misuse fraud. I'm giving you a context of why I'm calling you or contacting you within the first couple of seconds, whether that's email or text message. Authority, hello, I'm from Microsoft, or hello, I'm from the NHS, hello, I'm from the police. Again, give you some similar element of authority beforehand to actually know that you can trust me in this communication. Urgency, you must act now to get this limited time offer. And this, again, goes into the next bit, is that urgency, whether it's a panic or an anxiety, you must act now or serious things will happen. Scarcity, again, this is a limited time offer for you. But again, more importantly, is very much that emotion. So when you are having that emotional reaction, when we're exposed to these fraud and scams, we're not always good at being mindful of what our emotions are going to be in that situation, because that's what it's geared to do, is to try and get you to really think about it and that sort of thing. And this is very much where both it's the emotional aspect. Okay, well, I'm reacting quite badly here, or I'm reacting quite positively here. Well, actually, I need to take a step back, take a breather. And this is very much where the top five, take five to stop challenge. I don't know whose teeth I'm wearing, but the take five to stop fraud campaign is all about, is stop, think about it. Could this be potentially a scam? Could this be a potential? Is this again who I'm talking to? Challenge. It does say, yeah, challenge the organization, challenge who you're talking to and engaging with, but also challenge your immediate response. Because if you're emotional, you're not necessarily going to challenge in a given situation, but it's about challenging your own emotions in that situation, because I'm panicked, I'm excited, all these sorts of things that go with it. But also, like I said to Emmanuel before in that question, is protect. So if you do think you've given your details or you've made a payment from a scam point of view, is it's again reporting to your bank immediately as well. So it's really difficult for me to try give you an overarching trust your gut. If it feels fishy, it's going to be. That's not the base of social engineering, because that's exactly what I want you to do. Because I want you to have a gut reaction. I want you to be emotional. I want you to get excited. I want you to get anxious or fearful, etc. And that's what I want you to do. And that's why fraud is probably the biggest crime, again, the biggest crime type in the UK as well. So,
well, that's excellent, Paul. Somebody added into the chat that are police interested in this? And I can get why you might say that, because the copper who's walking the street probably isn't involved in it. It's whole separate divisions of police that are involved in this. Can you tell us a little bit about reporting and what's going on?
So it's interesting for me, because again, this is the concept as well, is that from a fraud point of view, now I sit on both sides of the proverbial fence. So I've been an independent, I work for the financial industry, but I also work in a national police unit. So I kind of sit like awkwardly in between somewhere. And it's very interesting, because from a fraud point of view, is that for so long, it was never, again, from an investigation point of view, fraud, and I'll be very candid, fraud takes a long time to investigate, because there is forensic accounting, there is so much that goes into trying to prove a great deal of fraud and financial crime, money laundering, all these sorts of things. And the problem is because the amount of time it takes to investigate, unfortunately, from a government point of view, from a national point of view, we still have very, very low custodial sentences and a kind of impact on a fraudster and a scammer. Is that's very much a fact, is that we don't always have that. Because for a very, very long time, is that it's been very much this perception that fraud and scam has been this kind of almost this white collar crime. It's a victimless crime. People don't see the impact. But since, especially during COVID, with the massive, massive rise in fraud and scams, where the criminals had to diversify just as much as we did during that time, is that we're now really starting to see well, we've always seen it before, but in less of a degree, the unique psychological impact, both emotionally, but also financially, that scams and fraud has. So even that person that is, again, the PC on the beat in that respect, law enforcement nationally is really pushing out that fraud and scams is everybody's issue. Everyone, every single officer, every single person, everybody in a single situation is being trained to look at what are the kind of the things that we looked at. And it's by no means a low priority in any way, shape or form, because essentially it's one of the highest on the risk register for the government. So, but again, it's been highlighted over the last couple of years as well. So it is very much a priority. It's very much this thing as well. The problem is that because it's an online enabled crime, it is something that's very detached. It's not like I've just burgled your house and there's broken glass everywhere, etc. Is that for me to be able to investigate fraud, like we said, that fraud is an international issue, cyber is an international issue, scams are an international issue, is that the amount in that sort of situation, in order to investigate, think about the amount of almost global collaboration, and especially in the light of Ukraine and the Russia war and all these sorts of things, bad enough as talking to another country in any way, shape or form, let alone global law enforcement collaboration in order to be able to investigate it fully. So this is why the real pressure is unfortunately very much on us and yourselves as the public, because the education is important. Because we can't necessarily have a presence as law enforcement before you're a victim, before you've been exploited, before you've given your data away, because it's with you and your device, you and your computer, you in that situation. We can't just post a police officer in your dining room. So it's the fact of life in relation to this sort of situation, but it is absolutely a priority. But the problem is, like I said at the beginning, not everybody's motivated to educate themselves before it happens.
Fantastic. I cannot tell you how amazing everything is in chat at the moment.
It's really good.
Excellent advice.
Really good.
We've got some really knowledgeable people on the call here. Could you talk a little bit about people who are embarrassed about it or feel stupid and they
Yes.
why they shouldn't be afraid to get in touch and report?
And that goes back to the point where I was talking about language, is that everything we talk, like if you're going to a coffee with your friend, or you're meeting for breakfast, or you're even in the financial industry and law enforcement, one of my biggest missions is to change the language in which we use around fraud and scams, because it's one of the only crime types you fall for. That also puts both the blame and the control in the victim's hands in a lot of ways. It also means that most of the language we use is, again, well, your intuition or your gut failed you, evidently. If you fell for something, it's not the case at all. You were manipulated by a criminal who was there to do you harm. That's what is the actual reality of the situation. So there's so much language in which we use, even with each other, with our friends, family, etc., is that don't be duped, don't be tricked, don't fall for this scam. Think about how many times we do that. But if I was to say to you, well, don't fall for that, what's your immediate reaction? Of course I wouldn't, because I'm not stupid. I'm not silly. All of this means that, again, it intimates the idea that there's something wrong with your character should you be manipulated by somebody who was there and their express intention was to manipulate you. Like I said before, I'll say it again, is that everybody has been told something they wanted to hear at the wrong time. You should have heard it. Then you take away the fact that I can't see the face, I can't see the engagement, all these sorts of things, is that this is where it really comes down to, is that because of the language in which we use with each other, it's therefore the language we use with ourselves. Fraud and scams, again, what we've seen a lot in relation to things like suicides, victim impact, the unique psychological harm, Because very often is that if I've been burgled, I can rationalize it. I can understand what's happened. There's broken glass, there's a broken door, there's a broken window, whatever it is, and my stuff's missing. Whether that be insurance, whether that be the situation. The problem is, for instance, in things like romance scams, well, actually, I'm grieving a relationship that I believed I had. Online relationships, online communication, all of the science, all of the behavioral science and psychology points to the fact that they can be more powerful, more impactful, and more emotional invested than real world ones. And most of you will go, that's rubbish, Paul, what are you talking about? But it's very true, because it's incredibly hyper personal, because you build the person, you build the character into an idealized idea and fantasy, and very much in these sort of situations. So they can be an incredibly hyper personal sort of relationship that has a great deal of impact on an individual. And as I said before, Sandra, is that actually most of us and human beings are experts at lying to yourselves. We're really good at it. The more and more I find out about it, the more and more we are experts at lying to ourselves about any sort of given situation. So it's this real difficulty of saying, well, the self-abuse comes from the language in which we use it. Is that if you have been victimized, impacted, that unique harm that comes from a fraud and scams, is that you were caught at the right time in which our criminal wanted to get you. And that's the problem. That's very much the case. Not that you've fallen for it, not that there's something that you should question about your own validity or your own understanding and your own psychology and your own behavior and your own mind. It's nothing to do with that. Absolutely not.
No, I've just noticed something that somebody put up about the Channel 5 series on romance scams, and I've watched it and thought, oh, I would never, I'd never ever get caught. But it's absolutely
never underestimate a human being's ability to conjure hope where they believe that there is none.
Yeah.
And like the Tinder swindler on Netflix, the Channel 5 stuff around romance, fraud, etc. If I say to you, and I've seen the comment around Professor Keith Brown, and I've worked with Professor Keith Brown many times in the past, and we've co-published documents together as well. And it's very much the case is that because of that hyper-personal relationship, because of the romance, is that you're taking the empathy and the context and the story in which the person's telling. If you've been isolated and lonely, whether you perceive you've been or you've actually been, you will do most things or believe in most things in order to get out of that, whether that be depression, anxiety, loneliness, isolation, all these sorts of things all come into this rich cocktail that makes fraud and scams so much more of an emotional issue than we like to think it is.
Mm-hmm. As well, some people have been talking about the copycat sites that maybe a cloning passport application or
huge.
health card and those kind of things. Are they being tackled, or do you just really need to be keeping yourself on the gov site?
So, for instance, again, these are what's called fish kits, and basically means that they are a copy of a website. In order to farm login details. So for instance, it could be a bank, it could be an account and the passport control, all these sorts of things. There's a number, they could be anything really. If you're giving details away or information away, then it could be anything. So yes, keep to kind of the .gov websites and make sure that the website is legitimate. Again, looking out for those different signs. But also the fact is that you have to remember that things like copycat sites, they don't always have to be that good. So is that very often when we're in a situation like holiday scams, we've had a lot of holiday scams over the last couple of years as well, because especially after COVID, everybody wanted one. So all of a sudden you had a lot of these sorts of fake fish kit sites and fake things on like Facebook social media marketplace and all these sorts of things. Now, the problem is if you're desperate to get a hold of that deal for that holiday, etc., are you going to be that vigilant about spotting that copycat website? No. And that's the problem in any given emotional situation or context, is that copycat sites don't always have to be that good. They just need to, again, if I'm looking at them on my phone or an iPad, or any sort of device, etc. Sometimes it's not always that easy to spot. But again, it's about making sure that you're, instead of following a link, you're then going to the website, finding it through different means, finding a site that you've gone through before to make sure that you've revisited that website before, and all these sorts of things as well. So it's a really difficult one, because yes, I can give you all the top 10 tips. And for instance, again, from Neighborhood Watch, have I been pwned? There's Get Safe Online. There's again the Take 5 to Stop Fraud campaign, which is an excellent resource to find all this information out there. But very much my perspective is that most of it is, again, down to your perspective of it in the first place. And that's why I'm here today, really.
So the Take 5 way of kind of questioning your actions is probably the best. Somebody else had done an ABC one, which was kind of believe nothing and question everything, but it's a similar kind of thing. And also, is it always action fraud that you need to be reporting to?
So from a Take 5 to Stop Fraud campaign is that the idea around stop, challenge and protect is the whole principle is to make sure that you take that moment, whether it's a text message, whether it's an email, whether it's a phone call, whether it's on a website, etc. It's about taking those moments, or those mindful moments, to think, well, how do I know this is who I'm speaking to? How do I know that this is the right website, etc.? Now, I always think that the kind of ABC probably takes you too far in the other direction, because unfortunately, this connected relationship we have with technology isn't going anywhere. And our relationship with data is very much everything we do and everything we're facilitated by, we have to give our data away in some way. So there is a balance to be found, but it's having those moments to say, okay, well, I'm going to double check. I'm going to kind of use my due diligence to find out who I'm talking to and when I'm talking to it, and things like that as well. Because again, very, very slim amount of information that I get to prove who I am. Generally, if I'm going to be talking to you on the phone or even in person, I'm going to need a certain amount of confidence to be able to do it. But the thing is, with emails and text messages, I just put it there for you to look at. If you don't, and I think, is it high volume as well? It's very difficult for me to, from a criminal point of view, to say, well, actually, I can send it to 1 million people, and people do that. So it's, again, coming down to that mindful moment of that stop, challenge, and protect. So what was the second part of that question, Sandra? Expand as well.
Report to action fraud.
Yeah. So first of all, the first thing you do is report to your bank. Is that if you believe you've made a payment, or you've seen a flagged payment on your account, something along those lines, is about contacting your bank immediately. Because the reason I say that is because we're the ones in the position right now to do something about it. Because as an investigator, as a person that's seen a lot of kind of fraud scams, is that what I do as a criminal, it doesn't last in the target account that you've transferred it to or you've paid for very long. Couple of seconds, if that. So what I then do is that, say, for instance, one of the people that we arrested had 50-something banking apps on their phone at least. So all I do is just keep on transferring to all these different ones, and I scatter it amongst global banks, global positions, and all these sorts of things as well. So by contacting your bank immediately, it means that that process is stopped where it can be. Now, from an action fraud point of view, is about, again, reporting it to action fraud, being able to say, well, okay, well, this is the scam, this is the overarching idea, and filling out those forms of reporting, and you're able to contribute to kind of the police effort to be able to actually combat a lot of these fraud and scams, so that other people aren't then impacted by it as well. So generally speaking, report to your bank immediately. That's one of the most important things as well, especially if you've made that transfer, and again, report to action fraud as well.
Fabulous. If we just come off of cyber for a minute and go onto the phone scams, I just saw a comment about call screening for landlines. Would you recommend that?
Absolutely. So there's a product called Truecaller, I believe, and again, any method of call screening is that it gives you that element to say, well, okay, we've got a phone call all through the time, etc., whether it's a landline or whether it's a phone call. Again, especially if you're reliant on landline, things like Truecaller can really give you that kind of first line of defense to say, well, actually, is this going to be blocked or something along those lines as well? So, and Josie is again say, well, you've been using Truecaller for a while, and it's a godsend. So, call screening is a really good idea. Again, all these are different platforms and products that are out there to be able to assist that, but I absolutely vouch for that if you can implement it in some way. So.
Poor Nicola doesn't get any calls anymore, she's saying.
No calls. No one does it. I don't even know. To be fair, I think it's been 10 years since the last time I used a landline. So yes, so I get that. So
brilliant. Somebody is fascinated by the picture of is it a soldier in a gas mask behind you?
Oh.
Got a bit of background?
It's a stormtrooper from Star Wars, but in a World War I military uniform. Yeah, because I'm a massive Star Wars fan, so yeah, you might have gathered from this side as well. So yeah,
fabulous. Do you want to leave us with some extra work to do, maybe some homework, some sites you'd recommend, or something that we can go and look on to protect ourselves?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, the best advice I can give you is to understand that we're all at risk. Myself, again, I've been a victim of a scam and fraud before as well. But the thing is that very often the stigmatization, all these sorts of things come through it, is that, hey, I'm an expert, but I'm also a human being, and also a human being that is subject to having emotions. So the fact is that there is going to be a flavor of fraud or scam, no matter how big or small, etc., that I could potentially be exposed to. And that's the same with every single one of us. So when we are getting a phone call, when we are getting a text message, when we are getting in these given situations, it's about having those mindful moments to go, hold on a second. It's taking that emotional mindfulness, taking a step back, and all these sorts of things. But also think about the context, authority, urgency, and the scarcity, and again, the emotion that people will utilize to do that. Now, on that basis, is that have a look at the Take 5 website, look at some of the education that's very simplistic and very easy to kind of digest, because sometimes I think I've saw the kind of the Little Book of Scams, and that's a really good resource from the Metropolitan Police as well. But also the fact is, you may not have time or the inclination to read about every single different trend of fraud out there. And I can safely say that pretty much all fraud and scams all want to do something with your emotion, no matter what the flavor, no matter what the packaging, no matter what the type of fraud and scams is. You as the public probably don't really care much about the current trends, but actually, because the trend, by the time we educate you about it, it's going to be moving on to a different trend. So it's a difficult one to really balance. So it's tough.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Paul. You are just so knowledgeable and so great. But also thank you to the audience. You've put some amazing comments there, and you're all helping each other, which is just brilliant. Paul is too modest to say, but he's doing a doctorate in his field now. So he's going to be the world expert soon, if not already.
Easy, Sandra. But I will reiterate that, is that I don't think I've been in a session for quite some time where I haven't had so much incredible engagement, and also you working together to educate each other in the experiences you've had as well. It's a really refreshing sight, because normally I do this 160 times a year in various guises, and most of the time I'm just presenting to my own face. So often it's the case. So, but thank you so much for really engaging.
And thank you guys. We're going to email you out any questions that we pick up that Paul hasn't been able to answer. We'll send them back to you, also with a link to the recorded session. And please fill out the feedback form, because that's how we get really engaging webinars for you for the future. I'd just like to end by thanking Paul so much. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Appreciate it.